I was born on the island of Taiwan, off the coast of China. I moved to America with my mother and my brother to join my father in America. My father had come to America 6 years before us to study. He was a brilliant scholar and one of only 2 full scholarships offered by the Taiwan government to study abroad. He earned a PhD in nuclear physics in 3 years and started to work. He wanted to stay in America, but also wanted his family to join him. But we had to follow the American immigrant quota system. The American immigrant quota in 1960 allowed 105 Chinese to immigrate to America. In contrast, the quota for Europeans were much more generous. For example, the quota for Germans was 57,000 annually. My family's weight in the quota system was a weight of not years, but of decades. My father did not accept this situation. He got together with other Chinese scientists and other professionals who have family in Taiwan, and they approached Robert Kennedy, who was a U.S. Attorney General, to help him to alleviate the hardship of being separated from their families. Incidentally, America was then in a space race with Russia and needed the talents of these Chinese scientists and professionals. So Robert Kennedy was able to persuade his brother, President John F. Kennedy, to sign a presidential order to let the families of these Chinese men to come to America and wait for their quota in America. As soon as my father heard that the presidential order had been signed, he telegraphed for us to come. During the 6 years that we were separated, we did not visit each other. The cost would have been too prohibitive. And we didn't telephone each other because we didn't have telephones. There were only those blue aerograms that flew across the Pacific weekly between my parents. The aerograms were these blue letters that you write and then you fold up into an envelope. So very, very compact. I was excited to hear that we were going to come to America, but I was also a little scared. I was only 4 years old when my father had left, and I had no memories of him. And I also didn't know what it was going to be like to live with a father. But life for my mother must have been very hard in Taiwan, to work on her own and to raise 2 children, and to hear tragic stories of wives who had been abandoned by their husbands in America. On our flight to America, we stopped in Honolulu, and the immigration officer did not recognize a copy of the presidential order my mother handed him. We were the first to come through Honolulu with it. He telephoned Washington, D.C. and verified that it was legitimate. But our plane had some problems with its propellers. This is a long time ago. And so we were delayed for a day in Honolulu. And my mother took the opportunity and hired a taxi to show us around the beautiful island. We saw palm trees, the palace, and the sandy beaches. Our next stop was Los Angeles, and my mother took us to Disneyland. And we spent a wonderful day there. At the end of it, my brother and I agreed that Disneyland was much better than the children's amusement park in Taiwan. After that, we stopped in San Francisco and had breakfast with my mother's brother. And I remember we didn't like those eggs and bacon, only salted, and not with any other kind of flavoring. Our final stop was Chicago, but we arrived 3 days later than planned. I heard later that my father had slept in the Chicago airport for 3 nights. How worried he must have been. My father was not only our family's breadwinner, he was also our bridge to understanding American culture. I remember one night after dinner, we sat around the dining table, either working or studying. My mother asked my father what the word laboratory meant. And I piped up, "It's the bathroom!" And my father explained that laboratory and lavatory had very different meanings. And everybody chuckled at my mistake. I remember my father being a very patient man, answering my many, many questions, such as, "Why is the sky blue?" He never made me feel stupid or small, but always made me feel like a valued person. Tragically, my father died suddenly from an illness when we were here just 2 years. It was a tragic blow for us. My mother faced many problems. Her English was not very good. She had no job skills, and she was a widow with 2 young children in a foreign country, without the rich family and friends network she had in Taiwan. But she decided to stay in America because she believed that the educational opportunities were much better for her children here. She had taken a course in key punch, and the University of Oklahoma, where my father had taught, gave her a job in the computer department. And our family of 3 survived on her clerical income and my father's Social Security benefits. But my mother's biggest problem was the U.S. immigration. My father had applied for permanent residence but had not yet received it. And with him dead, my family no longer had the legal status to stay in America. My mother received deportation notices. Can you imagine how frightening that must have been? It would have been so much easier for her to go back to Taiwan, to safety and to family and friends. But again, she decided to stay in America. She appealed to the university, and the head of the computer department and a physics professor prevailed upon the university president to write a letter to Oklahoma's U.S. Senator Maroney, who was an alumnus of the university, to help. And Senator Maroney introduced a bill for us to stay in America. The bill did not come up for a vote. And once the bill was introduced, our status was uncertain, so we couldn't be deported. But the bill did not come up for a vote. And when Congress adjourned, the bill died, and the deportation notices resumed. My mother asked so many people to help us stay in America. I still have many letters from people appealing to the senator for us to stay. Letters from the physics professor, letters from our neighbor, and even a letter from my junior high school's librarian. The following year, both Oklahoma's U.S. senators introduced a bill for us in the U.S. Senate. This time the bill passed the Senate, but failed in the House. So again, we received the deportation notices. It was an extremely bleak time for us. I remember once asking my mother why we couldn't live in a house like other people instead of living in this apartment. And my mother said, we couldn't live in a house because we could be deported anytime. That was a frightening thought. The shame of returning to Taiwan and the terror of returning to the brutally competitive Chinese schools. I never complained to my mother again of our material lack. My mother now took a very risky step. She moved us from Oklahoma to California, where her brother lived, thinking that maybe he can help us. Well, he couldn't. But fortunately, the bank where my mother worked, its personnel manager was sympathetic to our plight. And he took our case to California's U.S. Representative Charles Goopser. I remember once my mother took my brother and me to this bank manager's home. She presented him with a huge, beautiful Chinese vase. She also wanted to put our faces in front of him. We were not deported. 4 years after my father's death, a congressional bill to allow Mrs. Laurel Huiwei Wong and her 2 children, Janet Wong and Simon Wong, to stay in America legally was passed in both the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House. It is incredible to me today how my mother, without a college degree, with only basic English, and with no training in America's law or politics, had the courage, the perseverance, and the chutzpah to take on the U.S. immigration. I'm also very grateful for all the people who helped us when they had nothing to gain and when the goal seemed so hopeless. And that is my immigration story.
Love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage. Ah, weddings, wonderful things, but nobody has a wedding story where something didn't go wrong. The in-laws, the dress, oh my. Let me tell you my story. There was a lot of learning in it also. Well, my lady at that point and I, we had been together for about 2-3 years, and it was a very rocky 2-3 years. The joke among all our friends was that there was always a moving van parked in the driveway. She was moving out, I was moving out. But finally, we decided we could make a go of it. And we decided it was time to get married. Well, we were living in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts, to get a wedding license, you got to get a blood test. Needles terrify me, and that was almost enough to get me to call it off, but you know, enough good old single malt scotch, and I was ready for it, and so we got it. But what we decided to do was to get married at my parents' house in Westchester County, New York. And I had a Massachusetts license, and I wasn't sure if I could use in New York. So what I did was I called Albany, New York, the capital of New York State, and true story, it's called the Bureau of Marriage and Dog Licenses. Can't help but wonder if they're trying to tell you something there. But at any rate, I called them to ask them, and they said, no, I would need to get a New York license. I could come down and pick it up on the way, but they would accept a blood test from Massachusetts. Oh, thank God. So we were driving down. It was Thursday. We were going to head down to my parents' house in Westchester County, and I decided I would stop in Valhalla to get the marriage license. It was something that just struck me. Valhalla just sounded like a good place to get it. But when I stopped at the town hall in Valhalla, Valhalla was really too small, and what they told me was I had to go to the county seat in White Plains to pick it up. Well, it wasn't that far. We went to White Plains, we went in, we picked up the marriage license, and as we're walking out, they had a new bride pack that they wanted to give Beverly. Beverly had been married previously, and she was wondering, you think I should take it? I said, yeah, take it. At any rate, we took it, had all the stuff that new brides need. It had some laundry soap powder samples, some dishwashing liquid, some douche powder, all of the stuff that new brides needed. Well, we thought this was pretty funny, but we took it and we headed to my folks' house. It's Saturday morning and we're going to the synagogue where I'm going to do the opening prayers for the Torah reading. All my relatives and friends are there, getting us ready for the wedding. And I'm up there and reading everything and everything goes fine. And at the end of the service, what I do is I hand the rabbi the ketubah. Now, a ketubah is kind of the old ancient Jewish marriage contract. Basically, I'm buying her for, 3 camels and 2 goats and, 20 shekels or something. And it was done by a Talmudic scholar friend of mine, Stu, who as a wedding gift had hand-scribed it. Well, the rabbi looked at it and read it and it was very, very impressed. It was on beautiful parchment paper and everything, but he kind of looked at me and said, this is for a woman who's been married previously. And I said, yeah, Beverly has been married previously, at which point he took me, my father, and my uncle Hershey into the rabbi's study. The doors shut. Beverly was left out in the sanctuary wondering what's going on. And the rabbi asked me, has she gotten a Jewish divorce? I didn't know. I didn't think so. She wasn't very religious. And he said, we've got to get her to get a divorce. Because unless she's divorced, any children you have can only marry non-Jews or converts. I said, well, what do we have to do? And he said, well, it's still the Sabbath. I can't do anything yet. After sundown, I'll make some calls and see what I can do. In the meanwhile, you need to contact her ex-husband. Well, I came out, I told Beverly about what happened. I said, do you know where Sydney is? The only thing we knew was that Sydney, who had been on the art faculty at the University of Massachusetts, was now on the art faculty at Swarthmore College. And that's all she knew. Well, I did some digging and I found the phone number for the chairman of the art department at Swarthmore. And I made the call. I got his wife, who answered. I explained the situation. And she said that her husband was out on the golf course. And as soon as he comes back, she would have him call us. Well, a couple hours later, we're sitting around waiting. We got the phone call. What the chairman told us was that Sydney had left New York and went back to the University of Massachusetts for the weekend. And I thanked him, and so we thought and said, well, if he's coming to UMass, he must be seeing Gary. Gary was another faculty member with the art department, good friend of Sydney's, also a good friend of Beverly. So we called Gary, say, Gary, have you seen Sydney? And Gary told us, yes, he was here, but he left and went out to see his mother in Fall River, Massachusetts. All right, well, Beverly calls Sydney's house in Fall River, his mother's house, and she's on the phone. Hello, Sydney, how are you? I'm getting married tomorrow. We have to get divorced. Silence, as you could well imagine. And, well, Sydney, no, I don't really know what we have to do. Could you just please make sure you hang around your mom's house, and as soon as I have more information, I'll call you back? Great, thank you. Well, finally, sundown. An hour later, the rabbi calls us and says that he was able to convene a divorce committee so we could get divorced tomorrow. Could we get Sydney down? Well, this is New York. Sydney's in Fall River, Massachusetts. My uncle Hershey, who's there, says, no problem. I will drive there, I will pick him up, and I will bring him back. And I say, no, that's crazy. It's like, 4 or 5 hours each way. I asked the rabbi, do you suppose I could do something that maybe we could use telephones? I could hook up an amplifier to the phone so that he could speak and we could hear everything. And I had an old tape recorder with which I could do this. This was, 1970. We didn't have all this fancy stuff back then. And the rabbi said, yeah, I think that'll be okay. Sunday morning, we get into the car with Hershey, put in my tape recorder, we head down to the Bronx, to the rabbi's apartment. We knock on the door, the rabbi's wife greets us, she's there with her kerchief on, invites us in, and there on the walls are the paintings of the rabbis, all in deep thought, overlooking the Holy Scriptures. Beverly, who really didn't know much about Judaism, all of a sudden feels like she's in a Chaim Podik novel, all new. The rabbi's wife comes back carrying her tray with hot water and the jar of Maxwell House instant coffee to offer us if we need anything. There's another couple there that have just finished their divorce, and it's now our turn. We walk into the sanctuary, and there's the rabbi, and I hook everything up to the telephone. I put up the speakers, and there are 3 old men, long beards, high hats. They're the court. And the rabbi says to Beverly, I'm going to need to ask you some questions that only a husband would know, so that we know we're speaking to the right person. She panics. The rabbi goes, oh, no, nothing like that. Just kinds of questions like where you met, what you eat, everything. And so we calmed down, and the rabbi asked us these questions. We called Sydney. We had told them the night before to expect a phone call from us in the morning, and we would be in a divorce proceeding. And the questions were asked. And Sydney got every single question correct, except for one. He couldn't remember the name of their little kitten that they had for a short time, Paiwaki. The questions were over. The rabbi looks at the men. 95%. The 3 men go, 100%, 100. And this goes on back and forth for a while. And finally, the rabbi talks them into it. They say, okay. Now, to get a Jewish divorce, the husband has to give the paper upon which the decree is written. The rabbi says, will you make me your agent? Sidney goes, yes. And with that, as his agent, he gives himself the paper from Sidney. We hang up, everything is written out, and then the paper is folded in some strange Talmudic fashion. The rabbi tells Beverly to take the paper, stick it under her arm, and hold it, and pace back and forth 3 times. At the end of which, she's to pick up her hand. The rabbi catches the paper, takes out a knife, slashes it, and the divorce is final. At that point, Hershey takes Beverly back to the house. I drive out to the airport to pick up the guests. Now, I have to tell you about Hershey. We emigrated to this country when I was 4 and a half. And we had a little 4-room apartment in the Bronx. And my father brought over the rest of the family, 3 brothers, 1 sister, and they all lived with us for a time in this small 4-room apartment. And I remember going down to the docks in New York when Hershey was coming by ship. Hershey was my favorite uncle, turned out to be. And Hershey was a big man. He was 6'3", 235 pounds. This is Hershey. I was 10 years old when I went with my father down to the New York docks. And when Hershey came off the boat, I ran to him, and a customs agent grabbed me. And Hershey looked at him and said, "You leave him alone. That's an American boy." And the customs officer looked at Hershey and said, "American boy, you wait there for your uncle." A big man, one I loved, and he had this enormous Cossack mustache. And when I saw that, I said, I'm going to have a mustache like that. Since high school, I have had a mustache, and this is always to remind me of Hershey and the family. Beverly told me later that when they were driving back to the wedding, Hershey pulled out a bunch of letters. And these were letters from a woman that he was still communicating with, a woman that he was deeply in love with, a woman who was not Jewish. Hershey lost his wife and his 4-year-old daughter. They were murdered at Auschwitz. And as much as he loved this woman, what did all that mean? How could he marry a non-Jewish woman? What would that have meant? What would all those losses have meant? For us, the Holocaust was still very real. And as Beverly told me the story, it made me remember all of the Holocaust stories and how much of my life was influenced by those stories in my family, a lot of which I never knew. I remember being in America, noticing all my friends had grandparents. I had none. And when I asked my parents, why don't I have grandparents? They just kind of got real quiet and just said, they died. They too were murdered at Auschwitz. I only found out later. I came back with the guests to the wedding, and we went in, and the wedding was to begin. And Beverly and I were standing underneath the chuppah. And the chuppah is kind of a covering that's outside that is held at 4 posts under which you get married. And the rabbi looked at us and said, I can't tell you how glad I am here. It was important for my family that our rabbi was there to perform this wedding. But my family also, they weren't going to take any chances. The rabbi asked us if we could hold the wedding off for a week. They said, how? The caterers are coming tomorrow. My father, though, he had a backup rabbi just in case. But we didn't need that backup rabbi. He said how glad he was there to do it for us. And I said how glad I was that he could do this for us. For now I really understood my uncle on a much deeper level, and my family on a much deeper level than I ever had before. You can't have one, you can't have one, you can't have one without the other.
Many immigrants picture U.S. as a Manhattan, Hollywood, or Las Vegas. I came from Russia to Scappoose. Some of them you were there, and I see some of them you know. It's different. I remember that day when my parents came to visit from Russia, so I'm meeting them in Tacoma Airport and driving them to Scappoose. And my father looked at the window and like, where is America? Yeah, this is it. Well, I came to US, I got a job in Portland, downtown Portland. But I need to tell you, when I lived in Russia, I don't drive the car. But there are lots of public transportation. I relied on public transportation. So I need somehow to solve the problem, how I can get to walk to downtown Portland. Somebody suggested carpool. That was absolutely new concept to me. We even don't have in Russian language this term, carpool. So my American friends ask me, well, do you have carpools in Russia? I said, well, sure, we do, but we call them trains. The first time when it's for me to go and meet my carpool, I remember my husband and I stand on St. Helens Road waiting for the red Ford to pick me up. So the car arrived and the door opened and the driver said, "Hi, I'm Ann." So my husband looked inside the car suspiciously. Okay, well, kiss me goodbye and let me go. I was very nervous, what I will talk with. This 40 minutes, I will talk with those strangers? What happened if they didn't like me? So I'm sitting in the car. The driver was very talkative, and I was relieved. I'm like, great. So I just sit and listen. Next day, the whole team went to work. So I met all the rest carpool members. There were very many questions. Where are you from? It's like, what do you eat? Where you go for grocery shopping? So it was just absolutely new for them and for me. I work on my language skills. I studied English in Russia in school. But what we studied British version. So, some words, American language, it's new for me. So when I talk to them, they understand, but I sometimes don't understand them. Sometimes I'm just driving with them and thinking, what are they talking about? Well, but communication was the key. What I learned to communicate to my carpool members, there are more similarities than differences between American and Russian culture. The same family values, it's the same work ethics, the different communication styles. But when you contact to people, when you talk to them every day on regular basis with just ordinary American people, it's how you learn about American culture. I was really pleased. I think that carpool was a gift in my life because it gives me opportunity. It was a vehicle who brought me to American culture. Things happened and my husband and I moved to the city and I don't need to have a ride anymore. So I start a new journey. I start a new chapter in my life. But how I said, it's just carpool, that vehicle, who brought me to this American culture.